I'm going to first start off by welcoming everybody here on behalf of the university. There are some people coming in a little bit later because they're flying in and they're coming to the colloquium tomorrow, the Anti-Racism Network in Higher Education Colloquium, where we are looking at the issues of anti-racism in an era of decolonization. And I assume that some of you are going to be there tomorrow. We're starting back to front. Our respondent is Dr. Ruby Ann Levendahl. She heads up the monitoring and evaluation in transformation space at the university here. She's been working in the higher education sector for the past 20 years. And she wouldn't want me to say this, but she kind of straddles humanities and sciences. She has a PhD in chemical pathology that was awarded in 2015 by Reitz. And her PhD topic was the effect of an organic cannabis sativa extract exposure on glucose metabolism in obese and lean Wistar rats. I see some people's eyes lit up here with the cannabis, but we will leave that for another occasion. Oh my gosh! And then I'm going to introduce Andre, and then Andre will introduce the other speakers, and we'll get the show on the road. So Andre was formerly a commissioner, in human rights. He's had very varied life work, and he's a prolific writer, published author, book author, chapters, articles, etc. A supervisor of many masters, PhD, and postdocs. We have some of our staff members here at the university who are doing their studies with him. I asked him what I must say about this, but I must phrase it like this. He is in transition between two universities, but he's serving the country, So maybe you would just say, he's in national service, and he's the chairperson of the Ministerial Transformation Oversight Committee for Higher Education. So he answers to Blade. Yes. He's the director of the Institute for Reconciliation and Social Justice at the Free State, and he's also a member of the Council for Higher Education. So Andre, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Alan, and thank you very much for being here. Of course, I think it may have been more interesting if we could have launched a book on the use of cannabis, but we have an expert as a respondent. Ruby, you must just remember
not in use.
Higher education transformation and not confuse your PhD studies. In fact, she would have been in very good company because Bjorn and Daisy also very good. They have affinities. I'm just joking. But of course, the book that will be launched tonight, of course, is part of the series, and I have to say just something about the series, and we have more or less set aside this particular publication to launch the series, and it has been made available. So, of course, if you have people who want to pitch for a proposal, they are welcome. But we are already working on the third and the second and the third. The second will combine writers from UCLA, people at BU University, and writers on a series of colloquia on diversity in higher education. But JC can promise you that this particular book, the makings of the book can be a book in itself. The process of writing it. Because engaging with this, and he was rescued actually by Dion at a certain stage, because engaging with the Reitz incident is not an easy easy matter. The psychosocial dynamics that plays itself out whilst you process these kinds of matters are very, very difficult to engage with. And then, of course, you have to make intellectual and scholarly sense about it. And on top of that, you're dealing with an institution and trying to reflect and learn an institution very steeped in what one may call institutional racism. And I don't think that anybody would deny that in that particular space. JC has been in the philosophy department at the university. Of course, he also has different kinds of lives, and he would probably not want me to refer to some of the other kinds of professions. But he was a lecturer in philosophy and then moved over when the institute started to hold the space, and of course played a key role in the aftermath of the Reitz incident that generated the ministerial committee, of course, that had as its consequence the Sodin report, which of course tomorrow the anti-racism network in fact was born as out of the Sodin report in 2009. So there's a whole lot of things coming together around the issue of transformation and the book loans and of course the anti-racism network. And JC is now present deputy director at the Institute, of course a very, very key player in the university's transformation project. And of course a few years back Dion also joined us, also from the philosophy department. They were running away from philosophy, I'm not sure you've noticed that. But been very key role playing, especially with regard to the Institute also expanding its gender work. Both of them, of course, are very key mentors of the young people that we have in that space. Now, this is a particular achievement because that university is the place of work and the place where they spend most of their professional and study careers at. And so, I'm not going to say more about that. That is just to texture the background to the talk that they're going to give. So yeah, so JC, it's over to you and Dion, and then Ruby-Ann, and of course it's 15, 15, 15, okay, so 45 minutes in total, and then I'll hand it over to the House for engagement, okay? But it will not be a question and answer session like it is in Parliament, okay?
It's going to be
okay. Thanks, Andre. Must I use the mic? Is it? Okay. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to visit Nelson Mandela University, and in particular I want to thank Alan and your colleagues at CANRAD for inviting us to have this book launch here tonight. I also want to thank Ruby-Ann for going to be very kind to us as a respondent. But thanks very much for being willing to respond to this book. This is very important for me and Dion, because the reason why we wrote the book was we wanted to understand what actually happened there. Because up till today, there hasn't been a formal investigation by the university into what became known as the Reitz incident. And also on the campus itself, there wasn't a lot of debate either. It was basically played out in the media. And so that was why, initially why my motivation to write the book. And then when Dion came on board as well, we wanted to understand what happened there and what's the circumstances. But we know that this is our understanding, and that's why it's so important for us to engage on this, to hear other views. So that we can critically look at our understanding as well, and hopefully, in some instances, say, well, we didn't think about it in that way, because I think this is this is a theme. The theme of transformation and legitimation is not something that's gonna go away in the next few years. And even if you look at what is happening with universities globally, specifically in the US, this is the issue of legitimacy and transformation is very current. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to start with a few general remarks about transformation in general and the book and the University of the Free State, and then Dion will speak a bit more about our thinking behind the structure of the book and get to the individual chapters. Now, as you may recall, last year on the 22nd of February, the University of the Free State made headlines after white students and spectators physically attacked protesting black students and workers during a rugby game on Shimla Park. And that was actually a Varsity Cup game between Shimlas and the Madibas. The next day, protesting students detached the bronze sculpture of C.R. Swart in front of the law faculty. And this was 3 days short of exactly 8 years ago when the Reitz video became public. The granite blocks depicted on the cover of the book are what remain at the original site of C.R. Swart. And just as the Reitz video became the symbol of the struggle for an integrated campus in 2008, the image of the granite blocks have become a representation of the frustrations that the campus is still not one of inclusion. Now, 2 or 3 months ago, they removed the granite blocks, and the statue was then given to the voortrekkers movement, and they took it to their farm near Kroonstad. But personally, I felt like it was important for me that the granite blocks remained there. But that's another discussion. So it's kind of just like the Reitz is done now. Now this is gone as well. So some have argued that what happened on Shimla Park and the removal of the C.R. Swart statue is proof that little transformation has taken place at the UFS after Reitz. A factual assessment of the transformation process of the last 8 years at the UFS clearly shows that these sentiments are devoid of any truth. However, the assumption from much of the data that we analyzed in this book was that Jonathan Jansen started the transformation project at the UFS when he was appointed in rector in October 2009. And from our research, we can safely assert that this opinion is also not true. For one, the motivation behind the production of the Reitz video was exactly to protest against the transformation initiatives that were being implemented. What is evident in the events of February 2008 and February 2016 is that the majority of UFS students, black and white, were frustrated with the slow pace of transformation, while in both instances a minority of white conservative Afrikaans-speaking students were frustrated with the fact that transformation was taking place at all. At a colloquium held in 2009 on race, rights and rights, Kobus van Rochtelenberg, an old SRC president of the UFS, made the following pertinent observation about attitudes of conservative white South Africans after 1994. He said, and I quote, "Instead of celebrating with our fellow countrymen the coming of a new order, we insisted to stand on our newly founded rights to maintain our distance and privilege. We got away with murder. But instead of humbly asking for forgiveness and an opportunity to help rebuild the country, we insisted that our lives should, as far as possible, not be affected too much. We actually just withdrew deeper into the lager." Now, there remain significant resistance to the transformation process at the UFS. And we have to consider more closely why the transformation project has not delivered what it promised at the dawn of democracy. at the UFS, but also in the higher education sector at large. While writing up our research on how the legitimation crisis was formed around Reitz, we saw the legitimation crisis building up that eventually culminated in the removal of the C.R. Swart statue. We recognized the same rhetoric used against the adoption of a new language policy in 2015, the same rhetoric that was used in 2007 against the integration of the residences. And most probably, we will hear the same rhetoric again in the upcoming debates on the removal of certain statues and the renaming of some of the buildings. What the Reitz video does and did was to drew us into a variety of uncomfortable but very necessary conversations about these realities of South African life. These conversations are about acknowledging ongoing racism and inequality in our society. They are about rights, responsibilities and accountability. They are about reconciliation and social cohesion, the restoration of human dignity, and what to do with a persistent prejudice against difference. This is a matter of social justice and how it would be possible to absorb and pursue this concept as a realizable goal in broader society. And this is the purpose of this book, to problematize the rupture produced by Reitz. Furthermore, the two key issues that we focus on, namely transformation and legitimation, and the way that higher education institutions handle these going forward, promises to be seminal in the foreseeable future of the sector. So as I said at the beginning, we wanted to understand what happened there, and that's why we wrote the book. But I suppose I have to explain why I asked Dion to be my co-author. Now, in 2014, so my interest came after the Reitz video became public, though, and the lack of debate on campus on the issues. So I was fortunate enough to organize a colloquium the following year on Reitz, Reis and Rights. And that was mostly scholars and a journalist or two and some public figures that came to the university, and we had a colloquium. And that's when I realized that we need to look deeper into this. So that gave me the idea to conduct interviews with some of the important role players during the Reitz incident. Not the workers or the students, but we had interviews with the chair of council, the VC, some of the DVCs, student leaders, 2008, 2009, and that came down to 11 interviews that was captured on video. And then just once I went through the videos, I realized, but this is how we must write this up. And then came the media reports. We looked at over 800, I think, media reports. We looked at the minutes of meetings of the SRC, Council, Senate, Rectorate, the period before and after Reitz, the institutional policies, all the institutional documents. And the reason why I asked Dion was, first of all, I have to say, I asked her to co-author this with me before she was labeled by the local newspaper as a Engelse boervrou van Marquardt. The English farmer's wife from Marquardt. But I was in the midst of the transformation initiatives when the Reitz video became public. And as I was writing, I realized that I was writing quite a few pages in anger, and I was also very aware of becoming too subjective in terms of dealing with this, especially with regard to the interviews, because that was individuals that I had to deal with many instances. So Dion joined the UFS after the Reitz video became public, and was therefore the perfect interlocutor in discussing the events prior to 2008 and immediately thereafter. And being a philosopher like myself, she brought further intellectual depth and critical analysis to the research. And importantly, she introduced me to the theories on legitimation, which turned out to be one of the cornerstones of this book. And of course, being the English boervrou from Marquardt, her English skills are far superior to that of an Afrikaner from Van Park. So that is advantages as well. So, and that's when, so the book was in making from early 2011, and Dion came on board on 2014. So, and that's when he got, when we start with the serious structure of the book. So being both philosophers, the theoretical framework that informed our research includes a critical philosophical analysis of the cultural grounding of policies and practices at the UFS. The analysis of the transformation process of the UFS is situated in critical theory that actively seeks and advocates for social justice. In applying discourse analysis as a methodology, we follow Foucault's notion of discourse of being a complex interplay between systems of practice that are firstly historically contextual, secondly interconnected to structurally organized political, economic and institutional power and knowledge and their knowledge dynamics, and thirdly manifests itself in material, tangible, visible and audible realities. We've covered all this stuff, and before I give over to Dion, just when the Reitz interviews were conducted, interviewees were asked whether the book on Reitz is closed, and although they gave different justifications for their answers, most of the interviews answered no to the question. And Dion and I agree that the Reitz book is not closed. As I've said, there was never a full-scale institutional investigation into what happened, how it happened, and who or what made it possible for that to happen. Therefore, this is not an attempt to close the book on Reitz. We also have no interest in naming and shaming villains or victims. I think readers should be well aware that our analysis points to the fact that any number of individuals could have featured in the roles and narratives played out in this video. Our aim is rather to take seriously the events of this nature and reflect on how South Africans move forward in spite of the challenges they face, in an ongoing effort to live together and to imagine what real material practices of solidarity could mean for the UFS and beyond. We are also of the opinion that it is imperative for the higher education sector not to close the book on Reitz. That time has not yet come. Reitz will always be a reality for the UFS, and therefore Reitz serves as a reminder to the higher education, or all higher education practitioners, that our humanity is fragile, both in terms of who we are and in terms of what we can achieve. So it is impossible for one research study to tell the whole story about Reitz. Reitz reaches a level of complexity that extends beyond a single reading of evidence and discourses. A variety of viewpoints and nuanced analysis are needed to do justice to a multi-leveled understanding of the events. And we hope that this book forms a small part of this understanding. So Dion, how did we come to the structure?
Let me first switch the... Okay, I'll just say thank you and echo all JC's sentiments for having us. And I've never been to NMMU, so special thank you. NMU, sorry, special thank. I was warned about that today. Name change, and I go and forget. So it's a good thing I don't speak about the history of the book and rather just the structure. But we decided to, in the beginning, we were advised by some people to write a narrative or a kind of vignette or whatever you want to call it about the actual video. So when I watched the video, I had no idea how on earth I was going to tell this story in my words. It was an extremely difficult thing for me to relate to. Not only because of my upbringing, where I grew up, and then where I went to university, the context was just so different, and I had no way to communicate to a broader audience what this video was actually saying. So JC and I then decided to transcribe the actual kind of what do you want to call it, the verbal, what they said, and we tried to describe in between the scenes or the sets that they had created on the video. It is a very, very difficult thing to do because you had to repeatedly listen to what they were saying, right? And then after you had transcribed it, the fascinating thing to me was how many things never, ever, ever came into the press. Nobody ever reported that they were speaking to the black women, for example, in the video, as referring to them as sefebes. Never ever was that word mentioned in the report, the press, sefebe, difebe. This never came up, and I was flabbergasted. I said to JC, do you know? So some people had been under the impression that this was the name of the woman that he was speaking to, without actually ever finding out that this is, a word for whore or kind of a prostitute or something of that nature, and never really kind of bringing up that kind of verbal assault, actually, to somebody who has to watch it. It was a very difficult thing to watch and to go over and over again, and especially my Sotho is not good, so I had to kind of watch it over and over again to translate it. A lot of it was very muffled, the sound as well. So it wasn't a very comfortable exercise, but we decided to just give it a transcript and let the audience or the reader make up their own mind about how they feel on all those little more subtle things. And then to understand where they were in the process of transformation, because as JC said, it wasn't like there was no transformation on the campus. There had been some change, but we just wanted to be clear about what that actually was, what kind of plans were in place, what kind of reports had been given to the institution, what had been acted upon, what recommendations were not followed or were followed, or how did that come about. So the second chapter and the divisions of it follow that process of where we came from after 94, the difficult positions we then went through on the initial, because remember the UFS only admitted black students from 1993. So it was very, very late in comparison to perhaps other historically white or historically Afrikaans or historically English campuses in the country, where you had a little bit of integration prior to that. You had almost no integration prior to that for the UFS. So it was very, very late, and then when it did happen, it happened pretty quickly. So you had a big influx of students, very, very difficult because they were not allowed to be accommodated on campus initially. So they were, although black undergraduate students were admitted, they were then initially not allowed to stay on campus. Then one residence was opened, and for only black and black females and males together, and then separated, and then other residences sort of made place, let's say, for the new students on campus. So it was a pretty complicated thing for someone like me to understand, because I had come from a more integrated campus already in the 90s, and I didn't quite understand how segregated it was. But luckily JC was a residence head, and so he could explain to me that that was an extremely closed and well-preserved culture on the UFS campus. And us English-speaking South Africans, we're often accused of having no culture. So I guess on our campuses we didn't have much culture in the residences. I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, but it was certainly a new thing for me to experience at the University of the Free State. And then of course with that, because the incident had occurred in residence, it was in a male residence, it was in a white male residence, because they were still segregated in 2007. Even although the law, the constitution, the country would have prohibited racial segregation in terms of accommodation after 94, this still made sense to the UFS student body, the management body, and basically everybody else. I mean, so nobody questioned this. So if you think of it really, you were from 94 into a democratic South Africa, you're talking, you know, a good 13 years in, people still thought that it was a good idea to segregate residences on racial lines, not just gender lines or sex lines as they do now some. Right, so what we needed was to lay out the residence culture, because I didn't realize, of course, that this was so deep and so unevolved. You know, to use a terrible word, but it was so archaic to me that this kind of practice would go on, you know, these horrendous initiation processes. And I guess both of us being parents, you know, I can't even envision at the moment putting my child, who's now in university, through these things. And then worst of all, I can't imagine putting people into these processes where they are unprotected because they are previously excluded or disadvantaged groups. So people of color going into a white residence, for example, I shudder to think what happened to them. I still shudder to think what happened to them during initiation processes, because if they were brutal and that brutal for white boys going through white boy you know, kind of initiations, I don't want to know what happened when white residence leaders put black boys, for example, who were only maybe 15 or 20 at that point, you know, in a minority kind of setup in a residence. I just can't imagine what kind of abuses it opens it up for. Not that I'm saying it happened to everybody, but certainly it would have opened up for that. So with that all spelled out, we then needed some kind of critical lens to look at this. And I'm sure that you could use a million lenses and very, very, very good theorists. I mean, we know so many social theorists that we could have used to look at this, but the one that we chose is someone that we know. And I don't know Habermas personally, obviously, but I know his work and I trust his work for people who live in a constitutional democratic state. So if you live in a different kind of state, or you want to live in a different kind of state, an autocracy or whatever, that's up to you. But I live in a constitutional democracy, and I have to be able to think in a way that we can meet policy with practice, and practice with theory, and theory with praxis, and bring everything back down within a framework of a constitutional democracy. I don't have the luxury of working with other political frameworks. This is where I live, this is where I am, and so that was the thought behind using Habermas. And with legitimation, really it comes down to this. Very, very simply now, I'm taking a massive complex theory and reducing it to a sentence, which is a terrible thing to do as a philosopher, but in the interest of time, it really is just about, are the people, the structures, the institutional channels in place that can best benefit all members for the institution and the institution's good and the members' good? So it's not about having a university survive at the expense of members, or having members go through a system at the expense of management or courses or excellence or qualifications. All those things hopefully would function together with the people in place who can make it happen and implement it. Unfortunately, this was not the problem at the UFS in terms of transformation initiatives. Yes, there were things in place. Recommendations had been made, suggestions had been made, things had been tried to be implemented. what had happened is we'd reached a stage of institutional inertia where very little was happening within that 2006 to 2008 period. So when a big decision came along, like integrating residences, you would have thought that it would have been easy, because to not do it is illegal. I mean, it's unconstitutional and illegal. I'm not talking about doing something that's, changing the food zone to a ShopRite on the main campus. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about practice that was illegal. And when that test came along, the management was unable to make the change and very unable to implement it. And this, I think, was the value of the crisis event in the video and the explosion, was to draw our attention to the point that when you have reached inertia, when you are unable to implement or you are unable to take a decision, then you have a problem, and you have a problem of legitimation. Because either your management is not trusted, or they are unable to do what they are employed to do, or your deans or your structures or your various levels of staff are unable to do what they need to do or what they're employed to do. That's really what legitimation boils down to in a nutshell. So we had to look at it from after that. This lends things to things like reputation, reconciliation. These were all the grand narratives of the time. I don't know if you remember this, but reconciliation had quite a lot of national traction at this point. So we had to look at that, because clearly it doesn't anymore. I don't think a lot of people like to admit it, but with all the talk of social cohesion, solidarity, reconciliation, and various other things that are brought up in extremely important documents like the National Development Plan or whatever we're dealing with, I don't think we've been more segregated, divided, socially kind of incoherent actually for a long time. So I'm kind of grappling with that at the moment and how to reconcile it. But the end of the book, really just the last chapter, just makes some kind of suggestion as to how to move forward and away from where we were. So we were in a really values kind of oriented institution, religiously so, almost as if our kind of fate had been ordained by God himself, which we now know that was not the case, hopefully. So I think when you, at the end of the book, if you had to go into chapter 6, again, it's very Habermasian, because what that really boils down to is to move towards a rights approach as opposed to a values approach. Because whether you are arguing for yourself or your group, you are arguing in the same way. If you're arguing for everybody in terms of a generalizable maxim or a universalizable policy, this is at the coalface of politics, right? This is why you have politics. It's to form policy. It's to get people out of situations where you have no rights. And if you don't think rights matter, rights is like sex, it matters. Just ask the guy who doesn't have any. It's a very important thing that we recognize that people who fob away human rights are only doing so because they have the luxury of fobbing. They really, I don't think they actually realize what they're saying. And that was the opening story of chapter 6. Was this moment in the minutes or the memorandum that I got from the SR that they had submitted to management. And the first line was, "We reject the university's new drive towards human rights." And that just said everything to me about how they got to this incident. Because it is always the primary question from everybody: how did it happen? How did it happen? And in that moment when I read that memorandum, I understood how it happened, because it is, if you don't think human rights matter, well then that's because you have the luxury not to think that they matter. So that's about it. That's all I'm going to say, and I'd prefer to hear from Ruby and the audience.
Thank you. Thanks so much to JC and Dion. I must just say, in terms of my response, it will be sort of reflecting on the experiences that we've had in our institution as well. And what I basically did was to draw parallels, because as I'm reading your work, you know, it was sort of not light bulbs, but it was more identifying with what you were trying to unpack in terms of understanding what you were experiencing. So for me, this work is one that needs to occur more often in terms of reflecting on the contextual issues that has brought about such a inhumane experience. And I just wanted to say as well that it could have happened at any other institution that has the historical background that you have, which we also have. You know, so it could have happened at our institution as well. The only difference that I sort of noted was that we don't have, or we did not have, the challenge of lack of integration. When the institution opened up, we had white flight out of our residences, and it's primarily occupied by the collective black student. And one, actually quite recently, I think as recent as last year, there was a request from council asking that we look into why our residences aren't diverse enough. And I was thinking, I mean, for me it was like I was gobsmacked actually. There's a lot of diversity in our residences. It might not be in terms of color, but there's a lot of diversity in our residences. So that having been said, I just needed to get that off my chest. So I think maybe starting my response, I would like to start with a quote by Paulo Freire. And he says, "Man's vocation realizes itself in his practice, or praxis, which transforms and expresses the world. In its turn, his praxis conditions him and defines the horizons of meanings within which his further action is to take place. Education, like all other processes of socialization, tends to reinforce this conditioning process. There is no neutral education. Education is either for domestication or for freedom. Problematization means both asking questions and calling into question what is being studied. And that's exactly the national context that we are dealing with of the past, say, 2 to 3 years, as well as globally, where students are starting to question more what it is that are being given to them to study. So we know that universities are microcosms of society. And so what happened, the experiences that happened, I believe, is really a reflection of the challenges that we still face within our institution. And I'm actually glad that you quoted, that quote was as amazing to me. In terms of the negotiations that had taken place at CODESA, the initial premise from which that negotiations had taken place was to preserve privilege. And only after that incident happened in Boipatong, and the ANC wanted to withdraw, actually threatened to withdraw. There was not going to be a peaceful settlement. And only realizing that that was going to happen was there a switch in terms of the thinking, you know, that we cannot hold on to maintaining so-called power, you know, within the system. So using that as a premise, that the challenges that we still face within our society, what is the purpose then of a university? Because for me, that is crucial in how we deal with our students and the contextual, both internal and external contextual challenges that we face as society. So in a document that was developed by the Department of Education in 2003, they identified the idea of a South African university, a higher education in a transforming society as follows: a place for transnational exchange, an institution for liberating potential, a place for building African national leadership, a place for advancing both human rights and human development, and then also a place for critical reflection on epistemology and social conditions. So that was the framing of what the purpose of a university is. So in order to address, and we know, and you have also stated in your book, that our higher education system was basically based on, and I don't agree with the term race that was used by Prof. Janssen. It's really about population groups and language. And so they developed the system that was really based on separate development, right? And if one looks at what you also reflected in your book, the purpose of having set it up in that way was to maintain underdevelopment in certain groups, and then also to use the Afrikaans, the white Afrikaans universities, to support the ideology of the apartheid system. And then there was also reflection, I think, I'm not sure now, I think it was maybe page 46, where your entire purpose that the UFS had identified with was very much in support of, the people that they serve, which was white, and so we're still dealing with a system that is really, I think it is in crisis, but in terms of the ideological fundamentals that it had promoted then, what has changed in terms of the execution of its mandate as it is reflected here? You still have senior individuals within the system that would be either in the academic field or within the professional support services that had supported the apartheid regime. And what has changed in terms of their thinking, in terms of their ideological stance, from the time that they had served in a higher education institution that supported the apartheid regime to one that is now post-apartheid and advancing transformation? What has changed? The experiences of students within the sector is still very much the same. So according to the former Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University, he also identified specific roles to be performed by higher education institutions. So my response is really juxtaposing these key purposes and then relating that to the actual experiences that brought those individuals to actually conduct themselves in the way that they did, and to subject individuals in the way that they did. So the first one is to produce graduates that possess values, knowledge, attitudes, and skills acquired through thoughtfully designed and implemented formative and professional teaching and learning programs that engage simultaneously with disciplinary, historical, ethical, cultural, economic, and learning issues. The second purpose of a university is to undertake critical social and scientific inquiry and imaginative and rigorous scholarship of discovery, integration, application, and teaching that serves diverse intellectual, economic, and social goals and the greatest public good, which links to what you have indicated. Yes, each institution has values, but if one has your basic rights, then that is part of the bigger collective whole and the bigger greater good. To contribute towards forging a critical and democratic citizenship. to proactively engage with our societies at an intellectual and more generally a cultural level, to actively engage with a wider context and social conditions. So how can we do that if we don't enhance an appreciation for diversity? Like you said, there was separation, and even though there were attempts, and I know that many of the institutions, they do claim that they are initiatives, but just how effective are those initiatives in actually increasing the understanding of the value of the human being, firstly, and secondly, that the dignity of that individual, the human rights that is captured within our Bill of Rights, needs to be advanced, whether it be in our curriculum and not only the curriculum, in terms of the lived experience as well as the extracurricular activities. So I see that it's 5 minutes, so I'm going to maybe just what is required. There was lots of leadership, or you interviewed a number of individuals in leadership, and I won't question the intent of what they've got down in their policies and the initiatives that they have implemented. It is about the buy-in of not only leadership. Leadership will want to lead in a specific way in advancing the change. It is about getting the rest, the buy-in and commitment of the rest of the institution, you know, and also leading by example and holding people accountable. The fact that individuals feel that they've got an environment where they can call a person a war, where they can abuse a female, where they can actually do that. You know, the gender-based violence that we are experiencing in our institutions as a whole, the sexism, you know, the racism, all of that needs some form of accountability. There has to be consequence management. And so for me, I think maybe the last one that captures action, the intent should be followed by action, and there should be accountability of individuals within our institutions. So just the last one, it's a quote by Mandela. We in South Africa believe that all can learn, that there are more who are capable of learning at the very highest level of education than are given the chance. Even the ravages of apartheid in education could not keep our people down. But systems that still deprive educational opportunity wherever must change and open. We must change them to foster talent everywhere to the benefit of all, because that is where our commitment to fairness lies. This is where our ideals and compassion must be matched by action. That's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, the three of you. I'm not going to make any summary of all this kind of things. The great minds in the house. So, can I have the first set of questions? We'll get to 2 sets, okay? Okay, let me start off. To the two, Ruby, thanks for the, and that's just to start off, so get your question. I know people don't want to ask the first thing. JC, you said that you started writing in anger. Did the idea of guilt and complicity also dawn on you, and both of you as 2 white people dealing with the white university?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting question.
Guilt, I mean, for me, guilt and complicity informs everything I do. You know, wow. I'm white, so I carry very problematic identities with me in my DNA of supremacy, of colonizing, of dominance, and you know, all these kind of things. And it doesn't matter where I was brought up or what I was thinking when I was brought up. I know very well that that pedigree was inherent in all the white talk around me, and there wasn't any black talk because I grew up during an apartheid era. You know, apartheid only ended when I went to varsity, and then a different reality kind of confronted me. But I know that those formative years would have been informed by everything that is now being said by my very openly racist colleagues at the university, you know, which is all the usual things that you can imagine that,
But do you think that sense of complicity is reflected in the text?
Maybe not. I don't think it's reflected in the text from a personal point of view, but I don't think that Joyce or I intended to remove ourselves from it either. So institutional to us is institutional. You're part of it. You're not judging it from the outside. You're not writing, you know, from the other side of the river. You're in this thing. It's all part of the same fray. And unfortunately, with things like legitimation, it's not about an individual. And I think we showed that a lot through the interviews, you know, where people had said the right things.
Exactly.
You know, we were trying so hard to get this right, and we wanted to do the right thing, and we wanted to make the right decisions, and we consulted for 4 years, and you know, so you can't point fingers at individuals in council or management and say, well, it was that guy. You know.
No, I'm talking about the position of guilt from the authors, Jason, and then of course, you guys at your hands.
Ask Jason, he was there.
Pushing it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, personally, I because it was kind of a long road for me in terms of the book. You go through different things. I mean, I decided a few years ago that I'm not identifying. I don't see myself as part of a minority. In the sense of I see myself as part of the majority of decent South Africans living in this country, wanting to create a social just society. But having said that, obviously, being a white Afrikaner male, I'm very aware of white privilege and undeserved privilege. But again, for me to let go of unearned privileges doesn't make me a victim. You know, because I'm not really losing anything. So that's kind of the, you know, the way I think you can. I think that the stuff that we did cut out of the book, I think a lot of that I could have quoted in terms of answering your question, because it was in there.
Maybe could I follow up with a question there? Do you ever think that you can rid yourself of white privilege?
No.
No.
And that I think is the conundrum, really, because globally, you know, and that I suppose that is where the challenge lies in terms of the ideological premises that's embedded in our curricula, that there's specific knowledge or information being fed from very specific perspectives, you know, that sort of reinforces and endorses that privilege.
I think it's difficult. You see, I read an article the other day in terms of stats, projecting the Afrikaner or white population in terms of the growth in terms of the future, no?
Growth, shrinkage.
Yeah, shrinkage.
Oh, is it?
But and I mean that's kind of you see, that's kind of for me that you know what needs to happen is that we realized that, you see, the thing is we want to, especially at the University of Free State, for some conservative colleagues of mine, the first thing is they don't really act as if it's a public institution. They, in their minds, it's still a private Afrikaner project, and that is coming, and there's people that still think there's opportunity now to re-establish that or to get their feet in. So that's the one thing, and that's the kind of mindset.
Well, let me put it this way. Sorry.
Let's go to the questions, and you guys can take it together. D and brightness. Please.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much for your introductions. I haven't read the book, so I don't know what's in it. And you spoke about trying to understand what happened, but I also see, just having looked at my colleague's copy here, that you have a section on rethinking transformation at UFS. And so this is a question to you and perhaps anybody else who's from UFS, like the facilitator in front who is in transition, but still knows a lot about transformation at UFS. What are those thoughts?
Good. Let's take that as well. And then you can also respond to the one that I just cut you short. Sorry for that.
Thank you for the presentation. I think I have so many questions. Taking us back to 2016, being a black academic at NNU, and I know there was a story about Advocate Loiso Macapela, who actually ended up resigning because of issues of the discrepancy in relation to the payment of salaries at UFS. What I'm picking up also, the conversation that are coming up is UFS a home for all of us? That is, those who are the stakeholders of the university. But what seems to be puzzling to me, and I'm pondering on this issue, and it really doesn't make sense. You had such a wonderful leader, Jonathan Jansen, very respected person, and I still cannot understand where is the disjuncture in having a wonderful leader and having all these issues where there is no transformation, but there is a man who's talking about transformation. And I appreciate also the reality that in some point, institutions of higher learning, we're dealing with the memory of the university. As much as you can change the senior leadership, but in the middle, in the stomach of the institution, there's a middle level that are managing the institution and are actually contributing in reversing the advancement of transformation. So that's something I'm still trying to figure out. Where is the leadership, the championing of transformation as the VC? And how do we actually ensure that people are involved in implementation? One of your chapters talk about reputation or saving the reputation of the institution. Quite interestingly for me, that is business speak when you talk about reputation management. And we should also appreciate that when we look at institutions of higher learning, we talk about corporatization of institution. And one of the title, part of the title talks about the legitimacy. And from a legitimacy perspective, I think about stakeholder engagement. And what has happened at Free State University, the people in the Free State have come to realize that they have the power, not the leadership. And they have actually used that particular power. And the stakeholders, be it internal or external, I think some of the professors, without being misquoted, were responsible for not driving transformation or implementing transformation at Free State University. But I'm also picking up from what you have said, like using the word like Sifebe and so forth, because I'll pick up that Free State University has actually built a relationship with the media. And having built the relationship with the media, that also set the tone on how the agenda is set, or the framing of the messages that are communicated to the people. So there are so many facets that are involved in this particular conversation on how transformation is supposed to take place. Coming from a communication background, I'm always interested on transformation conversation. And my challenge at this particular juncture, everyone is having conversation about transformation. And my thinking is not that you are doing transformation. The question is, how are you driving the transformation?
Exactly.
So I'm also interested on what conversation did the university have in relation to transformation. And where the system, when they had the transformation conversation, where they actually noted and there was an action plan on what should happen moving forward. Because the norm is that we have the dialogue, bye-bye, it's rubber stamping, checklist, done, it's over. Thank you.
Thanks. Please go ahead and then I can.
Thank you very much for this informative discussion. I'm from sciences. What I'm grappling with here, I'm listening to you, but my question is, what is transformation exactly? Where does it start? The problem is, for me, I like the underlay of legitimacy that now you are coming up with in your book, but the problem is, when does this transformation start? Because if you understand in higher learning with what structures, there are students, there are academics, there is management. If you're trying to transform, you can't just students only or academics only. It has to be one thing. So if management is not part of transformation, as you call it, all right, and then academics are trying to deal with students or students vice versa, then there is no transformation there. And again, for me, in my understanding, transformation, it's a process. It doesn't end. You don't transform and end.
Exactly.
You continue transforming. That's what I'm trying to do. And my question to you is, what is transformation in your understanding? Because I don't get that.
Okay, can you start with you? Thank you very much. No, there will be another one.
Okay, maybe I'll just the last question. I'll let JC handle the institutional stuff. For me, I think transformation is not a complicated concept for me. It's change. It's being adaptive and responsive to a rapidly acclimating world that we live in. You know, at the university they tell you as a researcher you should be adaptive and responsive, but when you are adaptive and responsive, you get called into the office and disciplined. You know, so I think it's just about change, and you're right. I don't think it's an ending process. It's an ongoing process. The world will come up with something new tomorrow. You know, we can't keep up with the data availability, the information flow. Now with the internet, new things are coming every day. But I think the framing of the transformation debates that we have had at the University of the Free State for such a long time is spoken about in terms of loss. Sure. And really what that is and nobody will admit to this, because what we're speaking about when we speak about that kind of loss is we are speaking about loss of white, Christian, Afrikaner privilege. That's what we are talking about. So the indulgence and the sympathy for white Afrikaner loss is astounding. It's palpable. When black students come in just as much pain and just as much drama, and also finding it very difficult to locate themselves in the institution, to belong, to find a way to belong and move forward or find some kind of personal prosperity for themselves, that is met with almost dismissal. It's very often dismissed as victimhood, victim mentality. You know, I can't be helping every Tom, Dick and Harry that comes on this campus with a problem. You know, I really think that with transformation, to the communication person, I don't know, I mean, I do a little bit of work in linguistics, but there's a linguist called Kanagaroja, and when she speaks about multilingual transformation, she says we have to be radically other-centered. And we aren't. The way we speak about transformation, we are radically self-centered in terms of what am I going to lose if, oh my God, I can't teach what I was taught. How am I going to put Fanon into my syllabus? I teach South African law, you know, or how am I going to do this? Well, find a way. Find a way to make these things accessible to everybody, not just your group. And I don't think it's a difficult concept to get the head around, you know, but obviously, I don't know, I mean, for some people, obviously it is. I don't know.
Let me start with my take on transformation. I mean, the first thing you have, if you talk about transformation, you have to ask yourself, why do you want to change? I agree that change is a key concept. And, I mean, so why we need to transform at the University of the Free State is because we have a institution that is socially unjust to start with. And to say, so transformation for me is how to change that into an institution that is socially just. What do I mean by socially just? The three basic principles of the Constitution, to create an institution where people feel free, dignified and equal. And if you can start applying that in a different context, if you have to decide on the statues debate or the naming debate, and you ask that, if you look in terms of the curriculum, if you teach, if you're the lecturer, are you lecturing in a way that makes your students feel free, equal and dignified, and the same to the students? Their participation in the class and with their fellow students and with the lecturer, do they act in a way that promotes that? You know, and you can take it through all the structures. Because I feel, for me, the key word is dignity. That's really for me what's at the heart of the kind of society that we want to live in. I mean, and when you talk about dignity, then freedom, equality, and everything comes with that. So that's kind of, for me, kind of how I would say transformation, and that's part of the thinking that came after the book as well, because transformation for so long was framed at the UFS as accommodation. I mean, that was especially leading up to Reitz. So we haven't, I must just say, in terms of your questions about now as well, now the book is just up until the 2011 in terms of the reconciliation process. So we didn't write for the period after that. So you have to see the book in that context as well. So it's basically, that's that can be a different book to say, okay, what happened after Reitz. So that's transformation, and I think that will answer both of your questions. The kind of rethinking. I think the other thing I think that institutions, there's not a one size fits all. You know, in terms of our histories, but I think there's enough to work with a general kind of framework of where we want to go as a sector. And I think that discussion is, I'm not saying it's not happening, but I think that there should be a much more serious discussion amongst universities to talk about this, and but we kind of tend to be in competition and to save our reputations and do our marketing. I mean, and that's also because we want to get the best. Everybody's fighting for the best students and the best senior professors. So I think that's part of the problem, is that we don't have that sense of where we want to go as a sector. But hopefully Andre will, with the TOC, I think that can be a great vehicle to assist us in this stuff. I mean, you mentioned some internal stuff at the university, you know, in terms of that one case in the law faculty. I'm not going to, you know, respond to that. I can afterwards give you details about that, and about the great leader that we lost. I mean, that again, it's just one person. So some would view Jonathan Janssen's tenure there as very successful. Some would say it wasn't that successful. I mean, that happens to all leaders in all positions. People have different views about it. What I can say is, although the transformation has been frustratingly slow for various reasons, there is momentum, you know, and that's our, as you said, that's all of us. It's our responsibility, whether it's students, whether it's lecturers, whether it's the whole university community, and I think that is the challenge, is to get everybody on board with that. And a starting point for me would be if we look at the way in which we talk about staff at the university. So at our university, people will talk about the academic staff, the support staff, and the workers. You know, and that in itself already has a hierarchy, where I always say that we are all workers at the university. It's a public institution. We have different job descriptions, but we're all workers. So I think there's a lot of, we have to reframe a lot of things. I mean, because I think the way in which we talk about things, and you know, that because I refer to so-called academic staff, you know, because just that, and in the book as well, the whole idea, I use it as an example, the whole idea of the residence is a home or a house. I mean, that metaphor it's the worst one you can use for a residence, because the fact that that came out of the Afrikaner tradition of this is your house, and you've got there's a dad and you're the son, and then you have a house meeting and a house committee, and then you can discipline because there's now children, and I mean, you have to change that, you know. And I think in the transformation, the way we talk about transformation, that would be one thing, is to say, but let's look at the way in which we talk about things and the metaphors we use, and because a metaphor's it highlights something to help you to understand it better, but it hides something as well, which can be very dangerous. So yeah, so that would be my.
Sorry, maybe just in terms of the understanding of transformation, I mean, we're clearly guided by legislation that is out there, you know, in terms of, it's not just change for the sake of change. I mean, I think that is part of what we're suffering from. I know that you said inertia, but I think we're so busy being busy that we not effectively changing the essence of where the obstructions or the injustices or the deprivation of access actually lies. So, I mean, when we talk about, and that is why for me the key of the functional purpose of a university needs to be emphasized, because if we're not clear in our minds what the purpose of a university is, we're going to miss what we should be doing in our various core functions as well as the support functions that goes with it. So it is change to assist in achieving the national, or addressing even the national and societal needs. It is also change to address redress, because there has been, as we have established, the system was based on separate development, was based on segregation. So how do we harmonize and bring that to align with the human rights, you know, to a humanizing experience, to a liberating experience within our which is what a university is about. It is to expose you to different perspectives, to critically engage with those perspectives and synthesize your own truth from that. So yeah, for me, it's not just change for the sake of change. It is change with the purpose of the social good, the public good, and redressing the imbalances.
That's the challenge from Denise. Thanks, Ruby. And the one would be that I suppose that redress and equity must be a function of deep transformation and not a driver.
Yes.
Because I do think that making it a driver is to attach a skin color to transformation, which is also a dangerous way of engaging with the transformation project. So of course the metaphor that Brian has used about the stomach of the university for me is fact. And I think, for instance, that if one has to rethink transformation, it would be to invert equity and redress as a consequence of transformation processes at another level. And that means knowledge transformation, pedagogical transformation, change in institutional cultures, and so on and so on. I will more or less changing the content of the stomach of the university. So, and of course, those kinds of things are very, very crucial. I do think that leadership is extremely limited in the way in which I've now experienced the higher education sector. I think the layer of academics that we have, the layer of staff that we have, that has to be engaged within the transformation project is probably the area that we have to work a bit harder at. So one can say, for instance, that the new Vice Chancellor, in fact, one of the things, just to talk to my brother over here, when we had our new Vice Chancellor that just started here, one of the talks in his inauguration was that meneer directeur, as jy mooi na ons kyk, zoals mooi na jou kyk.
Wow,
we will well after you. Now, of course, that is a racist conscription in its entirety.
Oh my gosh,
of course,
really?
if you're not awake to those kinds of things, then the project of conscribing the leadership of the university into the reproductive machinery to, of course, protect privileges is already on the go. But that said, I've seen in spaces where leadership is extremely effective with regard to driving change, but also extremely limited. And it depends on certain kinds of conditions at play at a particular point in time. So I think, for instance, that Prof. Janssen was probably most effective post-Reitz in the immediate aftermath in creating that symbolism of a reconciled space. But I think the plot gets lost if the symbolism is not matched with the substance that is provided to hold the symbolism up, The same goes for all other kinds of, JC said it so well, people have different kinds of sayings about how leaders fare. But I think and I'm not so sure why we are actually afraid, but there's a bit of, transformation practitioners have a bit of anxiety of challenging the actual problems of the university. We like moaning about the redress and equity because that's the easiest things to say in a space like that. But going down to the idea of knowledge transformations, working with academics, and that's not to point fingers, it's to work with people. It's not pointing fingers. So it's working with the staff within the university space. Brothers, I'm not going to give you a chance. I'm going to get Pedro in you. I saw that small people. Zolisa, Pedro, you my brother, and then Rosisa, Zolisa. I'm like, oh, hello, how's it? Hello. And then I'm going to give the panel to close, okay? Right, Pedro?
Okay, thank you so much, Chairperson. My name is Pedro. My surname is Isabel. I'm a student at Mandela University. I just have a question. Number one, I bought the copy of the book because it speaks about an incident that took place in a residence environment. And that is what I'm currently studying for my postgrad studies. Now the question I have for the panel, it can be answered by anyone, is that in a residence environment, people who place students according to their rooms in these residences, it's residence managers, right? It's directors and administrators of that section of student affairs. We don't have professors there, we don't have a curriculum there, we do not have academics there. It's just administrators doing their job in that department of student housing. And the focus there dominantly is, okay, what's the budget for maintenance? How do we make sure lights are on? How do we, you get my point, the soul of discussions of this nature are not the amphitheater of that particular department. You know, the discussions, the sophisticated discussions that we are having there, it's not a daily discussion in the space of the Department of Student Housing. So my question now to the panel is, how do we take, I don't know how to put it, but scholarly staff, if I may put it, into that environment where these dynamics actually take place? Because if you talk about racism amongst students, chances are you will find it happening in a residence. If an incident of rape takes place, gender-based violence, it takes place inside the residence. And then the people who come to analyze it in a sophisticated manner, these professors who are academics, who are not based inside that department that deals with these issues on a daily basis. So how do you, I don't know, how do you plant these sophisticated scholars in that department, but at the same time make that department do its core functions, which is to provide a living and learning community, maintenance facilities? How do you balance the two, whereby inside the department now, this scholarly service will be offered, so that when students actually live amongst themselves, practically they do internalize consciously in their heads that we are in the practical side of these sophisticated discussions around transformation and racism and gender actually do happen practically. Yeah, thanks.
Please go ahead then.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I have only one question to answer. Is that to the panelists, do you think the renaming and the removing of things, does it really bring about change when you have an entire structure which is still in colonial in thinking? Because if you look at the university itself, then you have a Senate, for instance, whereby it is a decision making of a university, whereby the people that are there, they don't really adhere to all these changes, because it has maintained the status quo since the apartheid system. So I have only one question to you today.
Thank you very much.
My question kind of goes to Rubian, since she mentioned it, but the rest of the colleagues can answer as well. It's around this idea of transformation as a response to legislation. Has that kind of been critiqued amongst transformation practitioners or people who work in the space as the actual problem as to why we're not seeing any substantial or deep transformation in our universities? And how does the ideas of internationalization and globalization of higher education kind of influence how transformation doesn't become much of a priority? Because when you think about these other things, you imagine that the system does it for its own survival. But there is a sense, in terms of transformation, it hasn't been seen as a kind of survival issue. The system can survive without transforming. And then, again, on this compliance issue, there seems to be that trend kind of coming in that even decolonization the response is, how do we comply? Instead of a sense of critical intellectualism that says, what is the meaning and purpose of this and relevance in this historical time period?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Please. Last question of the evening.
Good evening. It's not a question, it's a comment.
Please. Last comment of the evening.
Talk about the influences. What we do there.
There are two terms which impress me when you talk about transformation. The first statement would be to say transformation is not an event, it's a process. And then today I also hear the inclusion of change. Of course, transformation talks about change. Have we sat down to analyze those two statements? When we talk change, we mean you move from green to blue to purple. That's visible, you see it. And when we talk of transformation as change, it means we need to see where one moves from, to which point, to which point. And that has been troubling me for a long time, because when I came to this university some donkey years ago, a long time ago, I wrote an article to the university bulletin about transformation. Everybody was like, who's this person? And then everybody became interested in me. And I thought, okay, I've started the conversation. But till today, we're still talking transformation. And which means then there is no movement, or if there is movement, it's very minimal to a point that you don't see it. Coming back to, for instance, what Rian was referred to in residencies as a white flight. I don't consider it as a white flight. I look at it as withdrawal. You withdraw. You see, in war, when you withdraw, you have not lost the fight or the battle.
Yes.
You just withdraw
Yes.
to regroup and then come back.
Yes.
So I saw that as withdrawal to regroup, so that when we come back with more force to retain. And you see that happening in our country. Probably that's where the problem is that we're not sitting down to analyze what has happened over a period of time when, as we're saying, we're transforming. And analyze that. But when you analyze it, you will realize that actually there has been regrouping and reclaiming of the privileges that probably we were losing at some stage. And that's where the danger is. And yeah, probably let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's start then now with Ruby. JC, which one of you in Dion wants to be last? D?
Yeah, let us say the final word.
Okay. Right, so I think Pedro, there was a question asked earlier about the leadership and why was there not significant change really experienced on the ground if you had such a dynamic leader as Prof. Janssen. And so for me, it's imperative that let's put that differently, individuals that serves within the institution needs to know what their contribution is in terms of the change project, however that change project is framed. Now, the reason, and maybe going then to yourself, Zuliswa, why I specifically indicated legislation is because people can choose to frame their transformation agenda in various ways and still not address the key and core issues that needs to be addressed. So you can change, like I said, for the sake of just changing, but not addressing epistemic access, not addressing the academic project, not addressing the disadvantages that had been experienced and how the institution as a whole is welcoming to everybody. So that is why I specifically made reference to legislation, because it points us, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it does point us to address very specific aspects that we might, depending on where we come from, might tend to want to avoid, because it is so challenging in terms of the change that is needed. So there could be superficial change, which, you know, the issue around the symbols and the naming, but how does that change the experience for the staff and the students in terms of a sense of belonging? Those are really superficial, so how do we guide for a deeper systematic and systemic change within the higher education sector? So I think I've addressed the symbols, I've addressed the compliance. It's not about compliance, it is about a moral imperative. And then also about how do you bring the individuals who might not be scholarly on board. It is about them identifying that whatever it is that they are doing is contributing towards that change process, and that should be valued within the institution, and that they are adding value in whatever it is that they are doing.
Thanks, Irma. Dion is going to have
the in terms of the residences, I think you raised a very important point there, and I think at different universities there's different programs. That's the University of the Free State. That's a definite focus areas, and Dion can speak a bit to it. But in terms of not just the time that the institute spends in residences having these kinds of discussions, but also getting the so-called academic staff more involved in this as well. The challenge for us is that students say that it shouldn't be just in terms of their on-campus students, because the majority of students are not staying in the residences. So at this stage it is to get that balance right and to create the same opportunities for students that live off campus as well. So that's one of our challenges, but there's some interesting programs that's being brought into the student life and housing and residence affairs, that's what we call it, into that. Not perfect, but it's happening. But I must say we are struggling with and a big issue is gender and violence associated with and that's this state's main focus in terms of the work that we do in residences. Naming and obviously the by changing a name or by changing a statue has got some symbolic value, but you need much more than that, and that's why I think that you should see that within the bigger transformation agenda and plan of a university, because and we are starting that process now in terms of mapping the narrative that our campuses are telling by the statues and the names that are there. And I mean, and then we must, as a university community, sit down and say, okay, this is the current narrative, and do we want to change it, and then how? Because I'll apply the same principle to say, but you know, you can apply this and say the building, or you go to a memorial lecture, the D.F. Malherbe Memorial Lecture in the C.R. Swart Auditorium, walking past President Stein's statue. And then, because that's a reality on our campus, and then to say, okay, but if you apply that, to say, okay, but let's take the principle of dignity, equality, and freedom, you know, and for, but it doesn't mean that you have to create a place where there's no discomfort. Because it is still a university, and there needs to be contested spaces. But you must be able to justify a discomfort that doesn't lead to trapping on dignity. I think that's the balance we have to get right. But I mean, just overall, you know, we can't for our campus. I don't know the situation here now, but Dion always referred to the apartheid all-stars, you know. That we have to really look in terms of the positioning, and it's interesting the places that these statues occupy, you know, front of the main building, you know, this. So, but we shouldn't treat that in isolation. I think that should be part, and the ideal would be to, in terms of getting these kind of debates into the curriculum in the classrooms. So that would be my name there. And then Prof. Keet always says that the university is so good at studying everything and anyone outside of it, but so useless in studying itself. You know, and that's really true. And I think that to come back in terms of transformation, I think the big danger is that, as I said, it's one thing to call for transformation, but you have to understand who you are as an institution, and to be very honest in terms of then what needs to be transformed. And how we want to do that, and I think that takes time. I think there's certain things that can happen in a much faster way, but I think that's the important thing, is to really put in the time and the energy, and that's everybody. I mean, that includes students. To say, but if you know, if we take the statues and this and that, let's sit together and let's study this, and then make informed decisions, and let's work with a plan.
Thanks, JC.
Okay, the statue question, I don't really agree with many people on the statue question. To be very honest with you, statues, names, symbols, and all these kinds of things. Because in my opinion, if you can't even do the cosmetics, please don't come with all your nuanced academic arguments about the deep transformation. I mean, we don't have one black political person represented on the entire campus. But we have De Wet, we have NJ van der Merwe, we have Seer Swart. If it wasn't for Thabo and Mazula and the other boys knocking this thing into the fountain, it would still be there. Still be there in that garden. We have MC Stein. We have, I mean, it is literally the apartheid all-stars all around the campus. These are people who did, you know, very bad things. It's not just like a benign Beyers Naudé type image. It's people who were quite happy to kind of, you know, trample on human rights for years and years and years. And so the cosmetic thing is important to me. And I'm very sure that it is extremely important to the 72% of those students on their campus that have to look at that every single day. If it was up to me, I would take a decision as management tomorrow to rip all those names off those buildings, get all those statues out of the garden, go put them at the back of campus, and then have your meetings about what to do to start all over again. Because it's getting offensive now. It's literally getting offensive. This is 2017. I feel like I'm living in 1984. So that for me is not, I can't be very calm and neutral about that issue, because I understand the students' frustrations, because I sit in those debates every day. But regarding the residences period, that's an interesting question. I don't have a definitive answer that could work for everybody, and we've tried so many things. What seems to be working better is that the students came up with a plan. They came to see us, the primes, so what do you call it? Like the head students and the kind of committee people. They came to see us and they asked us not to come with presentations. Because, you know, normally people have a PowerPoint presentation and they go into the residence and then they kind of lecture the students after the students have been sitting in lectures since 8 o'clock in the morning, listening to the same, you know, colonized curriculum that's been frustrating them the whole day. They then have to come and listen to people preaching about the value of the pedagogy of discomfort. So again, I have to give JC a bit of a slack because, you know, most of the students that I have to deal with live in discomfort all the time. They don't need to hear about how discomfort is just, you know, the most transformative, educative thing. It's frustrating for me to hear that, and I think it's bordering on condescension and I almost want to say patronization of difficulty, because these people's lives are very, very difficult. I mean, the kind of average lived existence of a lot of the students on our campus, it's a struggle. It's not just a matter of like, you know, having a few cramps to get to varsity. It's a struggle, like daily. So I have a problem with that kind of discourse. But in general, I think we changed the whole way of how we respond to residences. So now they come to us with the problems that they are having. And we don't go with a presentation. We try and answer and respond and take people with us from various faculties, whoever those experts or people might be, and we just go sit and listen to what they have to ask and say. We let them ask anything, and we try our best to respond with maybe 4 or 5 people even. So if it's gender issues, we take people of various genders and levels of scholarship to try and be more adaptive to the problematic at hand, rather than to come with another lecture, another set of data, another information sheet that may not be relevant. We also respect the individual cultures of the houses. So we don't assume that the culture at Tsolopele is the same at Kyalami, which might be the same at Villa or not. So there are different cultures within the residence houses. Even if it is a black male residence or a predominantly black male residence, the cultures are very different. So yeah, I think it's worked better for us to try and be more responsive to problem sets rather than to come with cookie cutter type solutions. But you know, again, I don't know all the campuses in the country. That may not work at all in various types of situations. So whether it can be anything for us, whether it's race, it's gender, it's human rights, it's medical issues, it's AIDS testing, it's anal sex, it's whatever. You know, they come with all kinds of things that they want to talk about, and we just try and, as best we can, if we have to take someone from anthropology to deal with various things, we do that, or find gender people, or find, you know, people experts in race. So that's what I'm going to say about that. And the internationalization, globalization question. Again, I think those kinds of concepts have very, very negative perceptions for some reason. I think it's because people in this country are so obsessed with culture that they think they can't survive if their culture isn't dominant and recognized and present everywhere on every street corner all the time. But for me, I think internationalization is an extremely positive thing. It keeps you on your toes to be exposed to other points of view. I think it's one of the best ways to decolonize anything, because it makes you responsive and you're never too sure of your point of view, which to me is one of the key attitudes of being decolonial, is not being too sure of that you know anything. And maybe just the globalization thing, there seems to be kind of a fear of everybody becoming the same. I don't know if it's permeated on this campus, but it's certainly on our campus. it kind of reminds me of those conspiracy theories where people were going to put chips in our wrists and we were all going to be controlled, you know, by some outer power. It's kind of that kind of talk, which I think is dangerous. I think there's a lot of value in having a sameness, some kind of global culture. Not that we have to all be the same in everything that we do, but surely there can be value in seeing every human in the humanity of who they are. I mean, is that basic understanding of humanity not something that would be very valuable, especially when you are dealing with people who perceive to be different? You know, I would hope that we could extend the same humanity to people north of our border, for example, who are sometimes found in very, very precarious situations, dangerous situations in this country. Women, you know, girl children, particularly vulnerable people. I would hope that global concepts like humanity would be useful in those kinds of situations. So I'm not going to talk anymore.
Thanks. Thank you guys. Keep them out. Aaron, you have an announcement and then I'm going to give you from Beverly to...
I don't have anything to say.
Mine is quick. Just to say thank you. This is the end of August. We have just to say so thanks to the people in the house, different entities organized events around respectful diversity. There were over about 50 different kinds of programming. Of course, it's not a monthly thing. It should be over the entire year, but there's a focus at the university, and just to kind of mark the closure of the month. A reminder that those who are coming tomorrow, please come at about 9 o'clock, because we are going to start at 9:30 sharp, and we're running a very tight program until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then lastly, on the 12th of September, we have the 7th Biko Memorial program, and this year it's the 40th anniversary of his death. And we have Professor Molefe Asante from the USA, who will be here in conversation with 3 of our students, an undergraduate, a master's student, and a PhD student who's doing his doctorate on Biko. So please remember the 12th September at 6 o'clock. Thank you.